and a very good agenda. I'm Shekhar Gupta. I'm your moderator for today. We're talking about India's energy future, and I have a panel which is really brilliant. I have Mr. Nand Khemka to my left. He's one of India's global businessmen who has interest in oil and gas and is an investor in a lot of energy industry. I have Professor Nicholas Stern. Many of you, if not all of you, I hope all of you are familiar with the Stern report on energy situation. He was chief economist at the World Bank, now IG Patel professor at LSE of Economics and Government, and also a member of the House of Lords. We have Tulsi Tanti. All of you know him as the wind energy man of India. He's brought wind energy to a country that had not looked at any other sources of energy for a very long time and has really revolutionized that sector in the past few years. Tejpreet Singh Chopra, the very young CEO of GE in India. I just discovered last week that he speaks Tamil as well as he speaks English and Punjabi because he was brought up in Chennai, so he's a man of many talents. But GE, as you know, is a company which sets the benchmark in energy technology. And we have Adil Zainulbhai, who is the head of McKinsey now. McKinsey has done fine work in terms of new energies and efficiencies, as always. Plus, whenever you need trouble, you go to Mr. McKinsey for advice, and I think we need a lot of advice now. So I will not take too much more of your time. I'll ask each one of my panelists to speak for just about 3 minutes, and then we'll set up a discussion. If I could start at the other end,
Sure.
Adil.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. Mic's on?
You have to press it.
Sorry. Good morning. I just wanted to start out by giving a little bit of facts to guide our discussion. If India is to sustain a growth rate of 7 to 8% over the next 10 to 15 years, there's a huge energy shortage, and power capacity would have to increase roughly from about 140 gigawatts today to 800 gigawatts in 2030 for India to have sufficient energy for all of its industries. This is a pretty rapid ramp up, and under the business as usual scenario, this capacity is likely to be dominated by low cost but primarily dirty coal to the tune of about 65 to 70%. In addition, there would be a continuing mismatch in peak load supply and demand. This huge peak gap will lead to installation of relatively expensive and relatively dirty diesel capacities for meeting peak demand, which is a little bit of what's the case today in many places, including Delhi and Gurgaon. Okay? So that's if we do nothing else, that's roughly the direction it will move in, and that is critical for the development of India. If we want to move in a slightly different trajectory and have a cleaner set of power requirements, I think there are 3 or 4 things that one has to do. First, and probably the cheapest, is to reduce the demand for energy through an aggressive push on energy efficiency across many sectors, such as efficiency of buildings, a fundamental shift in freight modal mix to rail and shipping by water from the current 30% rail and negligible shipping to about 40 to 50% rail and 10 to 15% shipping. That's a very cost-effective and clean way of using energy for transportation. And third, improvements in energy efficiency across manufacturing and industrials through creation of enablers like energy efficiency audits, ESCOs, energy certificates, etc. So that's a big push on demand, which by and large pays for itself. Second, increasing the rate of nuclear capacity additions to achieve over 80 gigawatts of nuclear by 2030 instead of the 25 to 30 gigawatts, which is likely without a huge acceleration. This would require a large private sector participation compared to what is being planned today. A third approach would be a systematic planning of fuel mix. So all power capacity is not the same. And the idea would be to have a systematic planning of fuel mix in new capacity additions to satisfy both peak and baseload requirements. And this is a big deal in India because of we don't have as much energy shortage on baseload as much as we have on peak. And a huge amount of diesel and other fuels are being used to satisfy peak loads. Peak power requirements can ideally be met through cleaner sources of energy, which include gas, peaking hydro, and solar. And so as a result, even if we meet our energy requirements, there is important considerations in terms of the proportion of capacity that should be peak. So to get there, we'd have to increase the proportion of gas-based generation by tying up gas supplies. Hydro capacity in India needs to be built to service peak load demand instead of current base load, which is what it's primarily used for. And among renewables, solar has the potential to partially displace diesel generation used for peaking. And solar generation peak coincides with the daytime peak power usage that we have. So a set of solar policies would have to be put in place to increase that. And finally, since coal will still continue to be a significant portion of the mix, almost nothing we can do would change the fact that a large proportion of new power in India would in fact be generated using coal. One could think about what is the right technologies that would allow that coal to be used in an efficient way. And so one would have to have a greater thrust on supercritical and advanced supercritical technologies to in fact achieve the levels of green that we would like to get. So overall, I'd just like to lay out the challenge from going from that would allow one to balance the requirements of the development of the country and the need for power with what it's going to take and the kinds of technologies necessary to actually get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tejpreet. If I could turn to you, how much of a nuclear future do you also see for India's energy?
Right. Thanks. Thanks, Shekhar. I think just to add on your point, Adil, I think Adil's laid out the facts really well as to what the opportunity is. Just a couple of points I want to make before I get into the nuclear point, which is the energy consumption around the world is growing at about 1.5 to 1.6% a year, which means by 2030, we're going to need 45% more energy around the world. And when you look at the kind of energy requirement needed, at the rate at which it's growing, it is increasingly unsustainable and economically unsustainable. And even when you look at it from a climate change perspective, it's unsustainable. So the question is, how do we fix all this from a long-term perspective? That's where the whole renewable debate and the nuclear debate really comes in. The good news is that in our country, there is a clear policy by the government to actually encourage the growth of renewables in our country. And as everybody knows, there's a real push in increasing the nuclear side of things in our country. Now, nuclear helps in certain ways. There's an increasing push for energy security around the world. So that mix of renewables and wind and solar and nuclear becomes an important factor. The second point is oil is still the dominating source of energy's fuel. And with the volatility that we've been seeing in oil and other fossil fuels, nuclear will become increasingly important in the whole debate because the cost of producing power from a nuclear perspective is very, very attractive when you look at the whole world. The third point is, if you look at just from an emissions point of view, carbon dioxide emissions from nuclear is one of the lowest, and it's even comparable with wind and solar and even hydro as well. So when you put all these three together, there's no doubt that nuclear will see a revival around the world, and I think it's the right thing for India to do to get back into the whole nuclear space as well. What I'll do is stop out here and then later on get more into details on the challenges we are facing with the nuclear story.
You are not so worried about, do you think some of the concerns about nuclear energy have now lessened because nuclear energy has become safer?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Shekhar. I think over the last few years, the technological developments in the nuclear space has increased dramatically. As a result, it is far safer than what it used to be in the past. We are now into third generation, fourth generation advanced boiling water reactors right now, which is a generational leap over what used to exist. So safety norms in the nuclear space has significantly improved in the last few years.
So we've moved on from Chernobyl and TMI.
Absolutely.
Professor Stern, if I could turn to you, because you are somebody who has to look at the balance of the two, balance of the conventional and the non-conventional and also balance in terms of what nations like India need and what they should calibrate for.
Yeah, thank you. In order to take on that question, it's important to look at the big picture of where the world needs to go, because obviously climate change is a planetary issue. The world, if it's to control the very severe risks from climate change, and of course India is particularly vulnerable, the world will have to cut emissions by at least 50% absolutely between 1990 and 2050. That means bringing down world emissions to around 20 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by 2050, or given that there'll be a 9 billion population of the world, 8 billion in currently developing countries, roughly 2 tons per capita. Now, United States is 20-something, Europe is 10, 11, 12, China 5, 6 tons per capita, India a little bit under 2 tons per capita. So given that the average needs to be 2 tons per capita, all the big places in the world have to be about that, otherwise you're never going to get that as an average. So that means that India, like anywhere else, will have to be looking for 2 tons per capita by 2050. A path I think most of us would see is perhaps India rising to 6, 7 tons per capita over the next 15 years or so, and then starting to come down. That can't happen unless India looks ahead from now at that path, because of the long lags and lead times in this kind of infrastructure. So that's the big picture. And to get down to 2 tons per capita means close to zero carbon electricity, and from that, close to zero carbon surface transport. Otherwise, it'd just be impossible. So all of us, India, wherever, are going to have to plan for close to zero carbon electricity, and following from that, road transport. So that's a big picture of where everything is going. Now, if you look at the India's climate change action plan, I believe those are the beginnings of a very good story there. Just to remind everybody, increase from 23 to 33% the forest cover, push very hard for renewables and energy efficiency. Those must be the right 3 dimensions. So I believe that India's set off now on a good course, but of course the implementation, but we've been hearing about the details of the implementation. It's tough, but it's feasible. You can see what's involved. And I think it's going to be a path which is full of opportunities, but full of pressures. I think if you look 20 years down the track, or even 5 or 10 years down the track, the willingness to buy products that are high carbon is going to be low. Lee Scott, when I was the chief executive of Walmart, that takes 10% of China's exports to the US, gave a speech when I was in Beijing 3 weeks ago to 1,000 or more suppliers and saying, our customers expect us to be low carbon in our products. We expect you, our suppliers, to be low carbon in your supplies, and we'll be checking. We'll be coming around and we'll be having a look, and you give us some numbers, we'll check the numbers. That's the pressure of the marketplace now. So if you look at India as a responsible citizen of the world, which it is, if you look at India as a business outfit, which it is, whichever way you look at it, that route I think is going to be the only possible one. But the cheerful part of the story is that this kind of growth will be much cleaner, more attractive, quieter, safer, more biodiverse. It's a very good picture of growth. Indeed, it's the only medium-term picture of growth, because the high-carbon picture will kill itself off. So it's the only route forward, which involves growth and development and fighting poverty. And it also will be, I think, if the economic historians will look back at this period, when we're moving to these low-carbon technologies, as a period like the development of the railways, a period like the development of electricity, a period like the development of motor cars, period like the development of IT, the big historic growth boosts which come from this new technology will be about going forward the green technologies. So it's a big way to go. There's a lot of pressures to go up and then down to 2 tons per capita, but the marketplace will push it, and the people will push it, but also I think that will be the growth story. So whilst it's tough, I think it's also exciting and ultimately the way to overcome poverty.
Mr. Khemka, do you see a revolution coming? And if so, do you see gains for yourself and other investors? I mean, investors are in big demand these days. In this energy revolution, I will then turn to the man who's actually causing an energy revolution. That's why I'm sort of saving him in the end.
Well, I'll answer your second question first. I'll answer your second question first. Do I see any gains coming? Very difficult to see any gains coming these days with the things happening all around the world. Revolution in technology. I think the technology in clean tech technology has been under evolution, development aggressively for the last number of years. And I'm sure going forward, as TP mentioned, for example, in atomic nuclear energy, it's the security angle that you, safety aspect that you mentioned. I have very little to say after my colleagues have commented on the Indian energy picture, but I'll just say a few facts, just repeat them. India has two basic problems. One is the energy deficit, which Adil talked about, and the other is the energy inefficiency. And with our current GDP growth of 7-8%, we would need to increase our energy requirement by 1.5 times to GDP growth. So you need about 12 to 15% energy increase in production each year to meet your 7 to 8% GDP growth. So we have currently a deficit of 30,000 megawatts because of the deficit, the energy inefficiency, transmission, power generation, consumption, etc. In addition to that, we have latent demand. 450 million people have no access to electricity. So when you look into all this, and I think Adil mentioned about 800 megawatt going forward to 2030 or 50. So we have to address this issue in a very comprehensive, composite basis. Oil. Our coal, as mentioned, is dirty. It has impact on the climate change. We import coal to balance our consumption of our coal from Australia, Indonesia, about 40,000 tons a year currently, likely to go to 105,000 tons by 2000 in the next few years. We have a lot of, I believe, almost 68,000 megawatts of power projects which are delayed because of coal shortage. So energy security is an equally important concern, or availability, if you don't want to use the word security. And so it's very important that we have energy for growth, and that addresses the question of poverty alleviation and so on and so forth. Now the question is thermal energy, nuclear energies, clean energy, and I think India needs all of it because no one source can meet the requirement, our needs. I think one of our solar production at the moment is, I believe, 50 megawatts. And the government is in the process of coming out with a national climate change policy in the next 6-8 months, which would outline a comprehensive policy net framework for development of renewable energy in the country. So you have solar energy, you have, of course, the hydro and the biofuels, the biomass, and etc. And this the government is aware of it, and this ought to give a big boost to in this direction in terms of investment subsidy, the tariffs mandate with regard to maybe Mr. Tanti will talk a little more on this. He's actually on the forefront of this sector. So I think to sum up, does India need is green, or we need everything? We need to improve the efficiency of our thermal power stations in terms of purity, in terms of its efficiency, and also through the whole value chain, transmission, consumption, household, and we got to put together all these factors. Thank you.
Actually, one person we are missing on this panel, and if there's somebody in the audience, please identify yourself. I'll keep coming back to you. Is somebody from the government. Because energy is still a sector which is very tightly controlled by the government in many ways. They decide how much power you will produce and where and from what and at what price will you sell it, and also determine whether you will get paid for it or not in many cases. So we have that one little gap here. But Adil, before I turn to Mr. Tanti, Mr. Khemka made a statement about solar power. In fact, I was quite astounded to know how small the figure is. Do you think it's because Government of India has pegged solar power only on subsidies and government patronage? That the philosophy that this could be so useful and so cheap in India has not really been utilized?
I think solar will play a much bigger role going forward because if you look at its economic use, it's actually most useful in places where it's very difficult for the grid to reach. Right? So if the prices of solar panels and solar equipment goes down for another year or two, right, down that curve, then all of a sudden it becomes very economical to in fact provide solar power to lots of outlying villages and lots of outlying applications rather than have the grid reach there. And then all of a sudden it becomes very economic. At the end of the day, it will take off both when it is economic and makes sense, as well as, the subsidies are in the right place to make that happen. And so far that interaction hasn't really occurred. I think if you just put in subsidies, but in fact it's used for the wrong economic model, wrong economic uses, then it won't really take off either. So I think the policy is just in formulation. I think it's just coming out. But I think the pricing has to drop a little bit more, and then it suddenly becomes very valuable to you. So for example, we have miles and miles of grid to deliver very poor power for people to irrigate their land. I mean, it's really poor. It only comes between 12 at night and 3 in the morning, and it spikes from 110 volts to 330, burns out everything in its path, et cetera, et cetera. And the advantage is it's either free because the state has given it or not. All of a sudden, if you had dependable solar power that gave you in fact didn't cost that much, both for the equipment, right, as well as of course the ongoing usage of it, maintenance, then all of a sudden you replace all of those very inefficient and extraordinarily expensive uses for that, and you can in fact provide all sorts of benefits. So all of a sudden you can have towers in remote areas that are telecom towers that are run on solar power for the most part, and therefore provide mobile phones and an opportunity for people to charge their mobile phones in all sorts of outlying areas that you cannot do. So it serves a very important social policy. I think the pricing is a year away in terms of the components from getting to that point, and then with the right subsidy, maybe 2 years. Who wants to predict, as somebody said, right, it's very tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that, but it hasn't yet reached the point where it economically makes sense in a very wide range of uses. And I think when it does that, combined with the right policies, it'll take off.
Tejpreet, I saw you poised to say something. This obviously is something that interests you.
Yeah, no, all I was going to say was 3 things. One is the fact that the current policy caps solar benefits at 50 megawatts. We need a long-term policy on solar to really make it going. 2 is the fact that we're spending a lot of money on various technologies in solar, but like you pointed out, Adil, I think any renewable source of energy, or any source of energy for that matter, to be long-term sustainable, it has to be viable without subsidies. That's how you develop a long-term sustainable model. And I think solar is still still some time away in terms of all the technology we're seeing right now. Thin film is appearing to be the most promising in terms of reducing that cost. I think we need to get down to the 7 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour to make it long-term sustainable. But the third point I want to make is the fact that solar, in my view, in countries like ours, has a lot of potential, because what we need in India is distributed energy. And solar can help provide that distributed energy system that we need in our country. So I think it's a great opportunity for countries like ours and China to really spend the money to develop certain technologies, because I think these technologies are going to come, the breakthrough is going to come out of developing countries like ours than even maybe the West.
Shekhar,
Tulsi.
just on the solar, currently it's a great opportunity in the country. Nearly 9,000 megawatt of wind power. 9,000 megawatt of wind power project is running in nearly 100,000 acres, which is sites are available for the solars. So we are exploring those possibilities to integrate the same infrastructure with the solar. So that gives the very good combination of wind and solar, because the wind is giving nearly 35% of energy during the peak period. By combination of that, we can go up to 55%. So that's the great, and we required not to invest on infrastructure, because that infrastructures are available today. So that can give the good combination. And the next level of the technology is the thin film, which has a huge opportunity in the country, because the major cost is the manufacturing and logistics. So we can utilize India as a huge manufacturing base, but required a very long-term sustainable policy frameworks, because any resources is not to compete each other. We can get the 1 rupees of energy and we can get the 10 rupees of energy. So we have to create a basket for that, and that is coming out the average, because that's the mechanism is there. And when people are talking renewables on a subsidy and anything, I think that is giving a very bad impression of renewables, because renewables in the globally and India is 1% to 2% is there. We cannot depend on the subsidy, but it's very important is coming out 99% energy which we are using, it's damaging our environment. So if we put a legislation like that, CO2 tax, then it's give the uniform and level playing field. Rather than giving a 1% family, it's an incentive, and 99% there is no penalties. And that's giving unbalanced situation, because the whole power sector is highly regulated is there. We are not allowed to sell our energy at the market price. So that's giving unbalanced development is there. So we see the wind and solar, India has an enormous opportunity. We can feed easily 30% of our energy today and tomorrow through this solar and wind is possible.
But what you are saying, if I understand correctly, you want a structure of incentives to be backed by a structure of punishments.
Not punishment, but we can put the cost of the environment damage. It's not a punishment, because what is happening, suppose we are giving a renewable 1 rupees, rather than just 10 paisa on every conventional source, that 1 rupees can be collected and given to the non-conventional. So it's giving a balanced situation. And for consumer point of view, it's not expensive.
But where does the question of efficiencies come in? For example, in wind energy, I was speaking with some environmentalists, some of them Sunita Narayan of CSE, for example. They say that their assessments show that our wind energy plants are very energy inefficient. They work at 14% plant load factor. Now that, backed by a structure of incentives and tax breaks, etc., sometimes looks like a funny deal.
No, actually the wind is highly dependent on the wind resources. So the resources is available based on the windy sites and other things. So it's a band is 30 to 40% plant load factor is there because of the wind, not because of the technology.
But not 14%, 1/4. That's what the...
No, currently it's in a global average is 25% to 40%. If low wind site is there, like in India, in Rajasthan, in Tamil Nadu is a high. So it's a 25% to 30% in India is there. But the class 1 site is giving 40% like in New Zealand and Mexico. So those the band is there. But that is because of the wind velocities. It's nothing to do with the technology. But what the real measurement is there of the wind industries is the cost per kWh. So 5 years before, our cost of productions out of wind turbine was, say in rupee terms, is a 5 rupees. Today we have bring down to 3 rupees 50 paisa. So it's because of the technology and the economy of the scale benefit and large size of the project. Like India, we have built in Dhulia is 1,000 megawatt one locations. So that is the largest wind farm of the world is there. It's a purely power plant. If we go on that size and local manufacturing, that is giving a very high cost competitive. We looking is because of the commodity price increase like steel and oil and other things, it is affecting to the industries also. But now today as environment is changed and it is giving a huge benefit for the renewable because commodity price has come down. which is the basic input cost in this technology is there. And the innovations and technology base is now going to the 5 to 6 megawatt size large turbine in offshore also. So that is giving a very good the economy of scale benefit, and that is reducing further cost. We see within the 10 years, this 3 rupees 50 paisa will go to the 2 rupees 50 paisa with the wind industries.
Professor Stern, you've been wanting to say something, and also do subsidy.
Don't have to be subsidies. I agree with my neighbour that this thing is not a matter of subsidies or penalties. What you're asking is that people pay for the costs of their actions. We normally expect to pay for the labour, for the raw material, for the capital, and so on, in the products we buy. We pay for what we deprive other people of. We deprive them of their labour and their raw materials. We pay for that. Well, we should also be paying for the damage we cause to others from our emissions. And that means that hydrocarbons should be taxed, or there should be a cap and trade scheme, one way or the other. There should be a strong tax around $50 a tonne of CO2 equivalent, maybe $25 on a barrel of oil. That's the kind of tax we should be looking at, simply for people to pay for the costs of their actions. There's not a penalty, it's just paying for the consequences of what you do. So around the world you see huge energy subsidies, including here, on hydrocarbons. It makes no sense. So that, I think, is a very important part of the story. And then you ask yourself the question, is there a need still to subsidize some of these other technologies because they have very strong learning elements in them, and you acquire knowledge as you go into them. But that's a way, I think, to look very at the story. I also wanted to make a micro point. I've been following one small village in India for the last 35 years. We've written 2 books on it. I was there this last weekend. And it's an example of something that we all know, is that agriculture in India is becoming much more labour intensive. When I was first there in 1974, the water table was 10 or 12 feet. It's now 40, 45 feet. That's a huge energy cost in lifting that. They've got electricity now. It came about 10 years ago. But still, they're using diesel pumping sets very intensively. Why? Because the electricity is on only for 2-3 hours in the middle of the night, if you're lucky. And what we're seeing, when I first went there were no tractors. Now there are 8 or 9 tractors in a small village of about 1,300 people. The whole of agriculture in India, for those 2 reasons, is becoming much more energy intensive. Now is the moment to think about the source of that energy, which is very strongly diesel at the moment. It's dirty, it's wasteful, it's polluting, and there is an opportunity to make that source of energy in large measure renewable, particularly solar. So solar is liberating for people who are not on the grid, but it also has to be available on scale, because we've heard about the kinds of energy demands that India is going to be making, the needs that it has. So we also have to be thinking about solar on a big scale. And solar thermal may be, as well as solar PV, solar thermal may be a big part of getting that energy on scale.
But at this stage, I'd invite members of the audience. We'll carry on with this discussion, but if anybody has an intervention or a question, please introduce yourself and then ask a question. If the microphone can be brought here.
Okay, let me ask a question. I think one thing is missing.
If you would introduce yourself first. Sir.
Waste to energy is extremely important, so don't miss it in the mix. And it's also solving the issue of waste. So it has, what I liked, Professor Stern, also your approach on the burden. There's a burden of waste which disappears and you get energy. So that's the one point I want to say.
Who wants to take it?
I can
Mr. Khemka.
make a few comments. I did mention in the passing about biomass. You are right, it's a very important opportunity, and it has a potential of almost 20,000 megawatts in India, and could be as much as 70,000 megawatts if captured appropriately over the decades. Now, biomass has a size converting more than 400 million tons of agriculture waste into 18,000 megawatts of power into 10 to 100 megawatt range power plants. And I think the government is aware of it. It will come out as a part of the national climate change policy, as I mentioned. I believe it's likely to be unveiled in June next year. India has about more than 50 million hectares of degraded land, which could be also cultivated and used for biomass energy. So, it is an area, and I think there is a small production. It is being used. Would you like to comment on it?
Yeah, no, two things I'd say is, one is a lot of venture capital money and a lot of equity money is going into generation of renewables. It is not going into conserving energy and into storage. So I think that'll be a great opportunity for everybody in this crowd to focus on going forward. The second point is, you're absolutely right, that what we are trying to do is look at a whole variety of renewable energy, one of them being waste to energy. One of the pilot projects we have right now in India is we have what we call the Embarker engine. We've actually adapted it to run on cow dung in India. So that, and we have a pilot project that's working right now where we're taking wastage from agricultural waste and actually producing energy. So we are experimenting with newer forms of biofuels and biomass to produce energy. We're looking at ethanol, jatropha, and other forms of biofuels in this space specifically, and also trying to find solutions for this market.
And another great opportunity is we have so many cities and new cities are increasing. So the municipal waste resources are also, it's a good available, which we can utilize and convert into the energy. So that will solve two problems. One is the disposal of the waste, and other side we can generate the more efficient energy.
I think some of that is also linked to just poor urban governance in India, just the collection and separation of garbage. In a city like Delhi also, which is perhaps probably the best governed city in India, that's a big problem, because if you go to the outskirts of Delhi, you know what the problem is, where the dumps are. But I think this is an idea whose time has come. I think if you drive out of Delhi on what is called as Ring Road, you find the shells of 2 or 3 plants that were set up to generate power from garbage. Those have been shut down for many years. I don't think those ever function. But I think as the price advantage comes in and as incentives and punishments go up, maybe some of this will happen. That side in the audience.
You know, the Indian garbage has no, what you call, the value, because the rack pickers pick up everything. There's hardly anything left in the...
Yeah, Martin Hemmick from...
Well, we recycle everything, actually.
Martin Hemmick from Stanford University. Relating to converting garbage to energy, I have an alternative seen in China where they actually use municipal waste and convert this into bricks fantastically. And that means if you do that, you get rid of the waste, and number two, you also save energy to produce all those bricks. So that's something that I would suggest to look at in India. It's still in the early stage of development. I have seen a pilot plant in Shanghai with the garbage dumps out there, just as you mentioned earlier. So that's something else you need to look at, which reduces waste, reduces energy in its production itself.
Who wants to, does anybody want to comment on that? Professor Stern?
I think this kind of ingenuity will be really important. I was in Brazil last week, and the conversion of bagasse, its biomass, is becoming a very big deal there. And I'm sure many people in this room will know Vinod Khosla very well. Maybe Vinod's even here, I don't know. and one of his companies is looking at the conversion of CO2 into construction materials, so you don't have to pump it under the ground and store it. And I think the pace of technological innovation in this area is just extraordinary over the last 3-4 years. And if only 10% of these ideas work, then we'll be able to tackle this problem.
Thank you very much. I applaud the recognition of the impact of externalities and being able to properly measure them when one prices energy. I wonder how one integrates in the positive externalities when one goes into biofuels, particularly those at the farm gate that you've talked about, jatropha farmers, for example, who have a new outlet. And how does one ensure that energy policy is developed in concert with agriculture policy rather than in isolation, so that the true impacts and the true positive externalities as well as the negative ones are measured when the government does their overall systemic policies? Thank you. I'm sorry, Shannon Hertzfeld from the United States.
Adil?
I was hoping that somebody here from the government, right?
Well, there
who
is
could answer that question. I'll take a crack at a part of it, which is the two broad problems in thinking about agriculture is a very big and political issue in India, obviously, and anything that increases farm income is high priority for the government and for the country in its development, right? Because rural productivity and rural growth is fundamental. So any real economic idea that allows farm income to go up is, I think, very welcome by both the farmers and the government. And so, you know, there was a lot of excitement about things like biodiesel and jatropha farming and others, and lots of experiments and lots of money have gone into it. The problem has been in scaling it up as yet, right? So today, everyone is hopeful that we'll find ways to scale up production of that such that you'll get, you know, thousands of megawatts of power out of it or millions of liters out of it. But today, many of these things are still at a proof of concept level or small, you know, people are doing it in a small way. So you talk about externalities. You know, it was, the high price of oil was a huge problem for India. The only positive coming out of it, or at least one of the positives coming out of it, was it made many of the biodiesel experiments look a lot better than they would have under $55 oil. And it'll be interesting to see how many of those survive or whether it requires a different scale of subsidy. So I think one of the, so the first thing I would say on this is that while the technologies are very interesting, the ability to scale up in a big way in India on the agricultural front is still to be tested. I think people are trying to do that. I think the second issue in terms of a broader policy, which is a point I made earlier that I'd just like to stress is, you know, when the economy is growing at 7 to 8% GDP growth, or even 6%, the demand for energy is so intense, and the clamor from everyone, from farmers to voters to industrialists, etc., for power is so intense that I think the policy is being set in place to actually try and provide that first, and then second, think about the you know, how to do it in a way that is clean, etc. Because what happens when you don't provide power, even if it is not absolutely clean and using the latest technologies, is everyone just turns to diesel, which is the worst possible thing you could do. So this summer in Bangalore, when there was a shortage of power, right, diesel consumption went up 20% because everyone was turning on generators. This thing happens in Haryana and Gurgaon all the time. And unfortunately, there are more cities and industries where backup power running on diesel is becoming, becoming a bigger factor. And that is probably the worst way and the most inefficient way of providing energy. So facing that pressure, right, one has to, as the government, or think about how to provide power that is at least better than the horrible usage of diesel that we have, which is all imported, by the way, so that creates an even greater problem. I think that's the trade-off. So when you're looking at the big picture, I think those are the trade-offs that come into figuring out not just the government policy, which is interesting, but the execution of the policy, which is often quite different.
And this diesel is not merely imported, it's also subsidized In fact, if you look around Gurgaon now, a lot of the new buildings that are coming up, including BPOs, they are now coming up with they're coming equipped with an underground diesel tank. So these are filled up like petrol pumps. Question there?
Thank you. Professor Lama from Sikkim University, Central University of Sikkim. I have two questions to the panelists. First, of course, is what are your views on the cross-border power deals? Energy deals, say for example with Iraq, with Turkmenistan, on the Myanmar side this way, and again within the neighborhood with Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh and all. Because we have done a series of studies in my former university, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and we have found that this is going to be a major addition to our what you call energy security. This is my first question. My second question is, we are all talking about renewables here. And the major source of renewables in South Asia, of course, and India, of course, would be the hydropower projects, right? If you look into the studies done on the glaciers across South Asia, particularly in the Himalayan regions, they are fast melting. In fact, in Sikkim, we have appointed a glaciology commissions, and the indications are very, very serious for towards addressing our energy security needs. My question is, what is the private sector doing in terms of really ensuring or conserving the glaciology aspects of the renewable energy? Thank you.
Is anybody here equipped to answer that?
Just on the second question, not the first. The glaciers are retreating very rapidly. The Himalayan glaciers are amongst the most rapid in the world. And the consequence of that, of course, will be, and is already starting to be, severe floods in the rainy season and dry rivers in the dry season. I think it's an enormous problem of adaptation, which requires a long-term understanding, but action in these next years in infrastructure which can give some chance of controlling. But prevention of the glaciers melting can only be done globally. That's precisely why we have to be cutting as a world by 50% by 2050. There's nothing that any one country can do about the glaciers. It's why a global deal is so important, and why, of course, India has such strong interests in a global deal, because so much of the population of India is dependent on the rivers that flow off the Himalayas.
Ashish Nijamwala from Ramsarup. Zainulbhai, I would request you to take the risk of predicting the future. Keeping in mind that the carbon emission has to be brought down to 2 tons per capita, how do you really look at carbon credit prices moving in next maybe 5 years' time? And number two, maybe, I don't know whether it is the right forum, but keeping in mind what Professor Stana just now said, what was really holding America to sign the Kyoto Protocol then? I mean, America being the richest nation in the world and was supposed to be most responsible, they should have signed the Kyoto Protocol also. So what is your take on that?
And maybe now that America has a new president and a new Congress, it might, is there a chance that it might? So I think it's directed to, one to Adil, one to you.
Sorry, you were asking me to predict the prices of carbon? I had no chance. If you predict the price of oil and the US rupee dollar exchange rate, I will predict the price of carbon. I think there are too many externalities, to tell you the truth. So I don't.
Do you see them moving up, moving down?
50-50.
Currently,
I would actually pass on that.
I mean, they charge serious money for that gyan, as you know, Professor Stern.
I'll give you a forecast for free. The current price in the European Union emissions trading scheme is around 20 euros a ton of CO2. So, depending on the euro-dollar exchange rate, $25, $30 a ton. And that is without a global deal. If we get a global deal in Copenhagen just over 1 year from now, I think we're going to see prices higher than that. I can also tell you what I think the world needs, which is a price fairly soon of around $50 a ton of CO2, and that's the kind of thing we should be looking for on a global deal. On the United States, I do think that the arrival of President Obama will change things. He's declared himself for 80% cuts by the United States by 2050. The right answer is 90% cuts, but let's start with 80%. You've got to change structure of Congress. I think what we need from the United States is a big advance in the passage of a cap-and-trade scheme, of a cap-and-trade bill, the sort of descendant of the Warner-Lieberman bill, through the Congress in 2009. It probably won't complete in 2009, but the rest of the world in Copenhagen in December has got to be able to have a reasonable take on where the US is going. It's got to have a good guess at whether such a bill will pass. And it can only make that guess by looking at the progress and how that is going during 2009. So I think that's a crucial element in answering the first part of your question, which is the forecast of the price, because what the US does affects Copenhagen, what Copenhagen does affects that price, and of course us all.
Sunan?
Nand Sharma from Alstom. Just a quick one on sharing the experience on city waste to energy. Having spent millions of dollars trying to do it in this country and not having succeeded. There are 3 fatal flaws in the entire program. The program is like this. It's promoted by one ministry called the Renewable Energy Ministry. The waste is owned by the city municipality. The approving authority is the state government, and the promoter is private. For this, you have a very failed program in Lucknow, which is shut down, bankrupted the company. Another one in Timarpur, the one you referred to just outside Delhi. And also the lack of recognition that the polluter pays. The rates of the cities, in the cities, it is simply assumed that once you pay the house tax, that covers every service, and that is not true. As a result of which, there's been a convoluted method of having the Renewable Energy Ministry pay you a subsidy to help to do that. It doesn't work. It has failed at least in three times over in 15 years. It does need to work, is what I would say. We are producing in the city of Delhi about 14,000 to 15,000 tons of garbage a day. It is not segregated at source. The methane still escapes into the atmosphere. That's 23 times more potent than CO2. So it is a subject which requires deep attention. The second one is on the other side, which is coal-based power is here to stay. 67% of it is coal-based power in the country. It'll continue to grow. It'll probably quadruple. And one needs to think of whatever methods which are economically palatable for carbon sequestration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris Traub from the Strategic Executive Search in China. Mr. Stern, you've referred to the importance of including the costs of production, whether it be in energy or, for that matter, polluter pays across production or all goods and services. Is there a path forward that's happening now as to how the costs, the ecological costs of economic activity will be calculated? Can you see where there will be a global deal that will recognize these costs and be able to use the metrics? Thank you.
I hope there will be a global deal, and it's the task of all of us, including India and the UK and particularly the USA and China, to work towards that global deal. I think the signs are that we could get there. I don't know whether we will. I certainly hope so, and I, like many others, will be working over this next year to try to help. But the mechanisms, I think, are to set the overall targets of at least 50% cuts by 2050. Equity demands, a minimal view of equity demands that the rich countries cut by at least 80% by 2050. That would, for example, in Europe, 80% cut is dividing by 5, so that would bring Europe's 10, 12 tons down to around 2. That structure will drive the prices. So if the US has a cap-and-trade scheme which is open, if the European Union toughens its emissions trading scheme, looks for 30% cuts in the context of a global deal by 2020, opens up to greater use of the descendant of the CDM, the current clean development mechanism structure has to be reformed to allow it to be much more on scale. But the mechanism of the establishment of prices will be strong overall targets and trading which allows all countries in the world to participate. And that's the structure by which I think those prices are already being determined and must be determined on a much broader scale, eventually, of course, eventually being quite soon, globally.
Question there.
My name is Harish. I'm from Selco. I completely disagree with the statement that solar makes sense in 1 or 2 years. Actually, in our country, it made sense 10 years ago. I mean, the question is not about the technology. See, houses, cars all become affordable because of affordable financing. And in many of the rural areas, when India has such a fantastic financial network in the rural areas, affordable financing at the doorstep makes so much of sense. And that's more important because technology for people, solar is expensive for the rich, affordable for the poor, because poor already spend so much on other forms of energy. Today, if you create appropriate financing at the rural levels, at the doorstep, people will pay for it. You look at the state of Karnataka. In the last 10 years, 200,000 home lighting systems have been financed in rural parts of India for a technology which is perceived to be expensive. That is because there was financing at the doorstep. So, and the second option is for solar, which is powering inefficient products. The question is when I have to go and design a system for a swing machine, the swing machine is inefficient, but the problem is people say solar is expensive. There are two aspects. How do you create affordable creative financing at the rural areas? And then how do you create efficient products? It's not the technology which is expensive. It was affordable in 94, 95. Why are we pushing it further down?
So if you could give some details of how this financing has been brought about in Karnataka. Who's paying and how is it paid back?
See, if you look at Syndicate Bank, Canara Bank, Malaprabha Gramin Bank, Karnataka Vikas Gramin Bank, all have financing programs for solar home lighting systems. Financing is done between 7 to 12%, 12.5% rate of interest. By many of these banks, around 800 branches of these banks finance with no capital subsidy from the state government, no capital subsidies. There are 5 or 6 suppliers who supply at the doorstep, create a service mechanism, and then there's a doorstep financing. This is what needs to be taken up very seriously in our country. If RBI then with NABARD allocates 5% of financing to be done for solar power, 5%, 2% for entrepreneurs to have working capital, 3% for end user financing. Just like how agricultural financing could revolution 40 years ago, you'll see a massive change. Why are we just talking about technology?
And how old is this experiment in Karnataka?
94 it started, 95.
That means banks are getting paid back.
That's how they're surviving on. It's us creating how more and more banks are getting into financing this in the state of Karnataka.
Tulsi, do you think
I just want to make a comment. But you didn't introduce yourself properly. That is, Harish Hande is our last year's Klaus Schwab Social Entrepreneur of the Year. And he's done a lot of work in solar energy and solar lanterns, which he's developed and markets them commercially. So he can talk a lot about it.
Well, I think I'll see you afterwards. I need to buy a few of those. I have a story of my own on trying to install a solar pump and wrestling with the regime of subsidies and financing. And I can't even buy it off the shelf. I have to go through a regime of subsidies and finances and sign many humiliating affidavits and written in bad English and sign away a lot of my rights, God knows, maybe even the cow on the farm. So, Tulsi, do you think this regime of, this network of subsidies, incentives, disincentives, does it work in your own business? Are you happier with all the tax breaks? I know there are many here, I see Nimesh Bhai right there in his community, in the financial community, who raise questions. I'm not saying he raises questions, but in his community they raise questions that the wind energy is all about tax breaks. It's a tax scam. So anything in India which is mainly driven by incentives, disincentives, tax breaks, has the potential of becoming a scam.
Actually, that's some impression about the wind industries or renewable. This sector depend on the subsidies there. Today, honestly, there is no subsidies are available in wind power projects in India. Only the accelerated depreciation benefit is available. And that is normally it's available, any capital goods investment is there, so that is available. It's nothing extra is there. Earlier days, some tax benefit was available is there. Last 2 years, we are struggling with our government also. Okay, in lieu of the accelerated depreciation benefit, please provide us the transferable tax credit. It's a similar concept of the production tax credit which is available in the US is there. If we don't want to put like that, please go on the carbon tax and give a 1 rupees benefit of that. Because what is happening, the cost of the power production has to make it commercially viable. That's the objective is there. And now the technology and large size of the projects, it's directly competing the conventional power. There is no issues are there. Now the question is, what acceleration is required? If we want to build more and more wind power and faster way, we have to attract the investment in the wind power projects. And for that, it is some benefits are required to make a level playing field point of view. So what we are recommending to the government at this juncture is a TTC. It's a transferable tax credit. If that will be introduced 1 rupees in a 10-year basis, then wind power project is becoming very lucrative investment, and we can attract the large investment in this, because India has a 45,000 megawatt potentiality in onshore is there, and offshore is nearly 55,000 megawatts. So 100,000 megawatt we can explore that, and it's a really very cost competitive resources are there. Not only that, now India has a great technology also in that front, because we are exporting every year more than 2,000 megawatt to developed world like US and Europe. So the technology is not a constraint for us is there, and local manufacturing is there. So we can utilize those with the policy framework and regulatory mechanisms in such a manner, then I think it is a good explore is possible is there. So what we are looking in the country like us, okay, let's set the RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standards. It should be by 2020, 20% has to come. Not only that, it should be a mandatory to the utility company, so that the feed-in low tariff which we have in the Europe, if we introduce like that combination, it's give a huge opportunity for us to expand the capacity, and we can provide more wind power is there. Last 3 years in India, nearly 20 to 25% energy is coming from wind power projects. So we are contributing large in that, and you will be surprised, today India is the 4th largest country in the world, after the Germany, US and Spain. So we are parallel to the developed world is there. It's truly we have to explore more efficient way through the policy framework and also the state level execution support.
Tejpreet?
Yeah, just two quick points. One is on the point on financing. I think my concern is, as soon as, the same thing that happened in the 80s, as soon as the traditional sources of energy, of fuel, start declining, like oil is declining, you suddenly see a dramatic decline in spend on renewable energy. And I was just seeing some stats the other day that in 2008, as oil prices have come down, there has been a decline in investment into renewable energy. We've seen cancellations of certain orders in the wind space in the United States. So I hope that governments around the world, as oil prices decline, don't give up the focus on renewable energies. That's point one. Two is the Indian government has done a great job in pushing renewable energy. The only additional point that I'd make is the fact that we need to move away from the tax credits to provide generation-based incentives. The government has started that in India. I hope we continue to push that, because that will then push all of us in the industry to start making more efficient and more productive windmills, so that the whole capacity, the productivity improves in the system.
Question from there, and if there's anybody else who I've missed out on, maybe in the back, please raise your hands now, because we are coming to the end of this session.
My name is Arun Nanda from Mahindra & Mahindra. I have a question, and I want to share two little experiences. My question is that being a rural company, we see that probably we can look at decentralized power generation, because like water, power, the transmission costs are very high. While we have successfully, as my friend said, and we've also invested in a solar lighting, but I'm talking of generating power in the local area which is consumed locally. Are there technologies people are working on? Because that would bring down the generation costs, the cost substantially, because I understand a substantial part of transmission, and we also know what happens on transmission losses. My two experiences I want to share is that we did a project in Tirupati, which we thought was the best place to do a solid waste management, because there's no industry and no hospital. So you'll get all biodegradable, but you get 45% plastic, and no amount of education has helped. The second is the project Sunny Sharma talked about, We looked at that project when the financial institutions came to us. We found to our horror that there was nothing fundamentally wrong with that solid waste to power project. The problem was that the transporter lobby did not want that project to take off because they had a vested interest and was dumping building debris into the site. So there was nothing you could do with the project. And political situation being what it is in Lucknow, we actually ran away from the project. The project fundamentals were perfect. You couldn't have got a better project. It was a transporter lobby with dumping debris in that site instead of garbage, and that's why the project didn't take off. Thank you.
Well, that's interesting, and that only shows that these things can work in a country like India when people by and large get interested in it, because then they will make sure transporters don't.
That's the point I was trying to make, that I think we need to create awareness with people.
Right.
You can get fertilizer, you can get power, segregate this thing, and we need to get counter lobbies to the invested interest to see that we need this sort of situation. So
Madhu?
political will and media, Mr. Gupta, that's why I raised the question.
Right.
We need support from you to bring awareness.
Now you are taking my time.
But I can say I'm in a business where everything is recycled, and I'm not referring to news. Every page on which we print is recycled in India. Madhur.
My name is Madhur Bajaj. Shekhar, I'm surprised you forgot about the famous food versus fuel debate. My point is, I'm sure all of you, I don't have to explain myself, the food versus fuel debate which is going on in India for some time now, that consumption in India is increasing, as mentioned by President Bush also, and I don't think he meant it negatively, but he mentioned a fact that, and that's good that consumption is increasing. We want poor people not to be malnourished. But whether if we substitute that with biofuels, whether there will be shortage of food. And there my point to the panel is that jatropha, if we try and focus on jatropha, which can grow on waste land, where agriculture is not possible, can solve the problem and end this debate.
Does anybody want to take it? Because we just have about a minute left. Professor Stern.
I think we really do have to look at the second and third generation of biofuels to discover fuels which, and jatropha looks promising, which grow on semi-arid land. And there's a big areas in the world of semi-arid land in Central Asia, around the Kalahari, around the Sahara, and some parts of India too. And that, I think, will be the future of biofuels. It may actually help in some cases to stop desertification, so it could have a positive effect there. But we have to find out, and the question that you put must be constantly in our minds. But if we think running forward of aviation, I think some form of biofuel will be the future in aviation, because electricity or hydrogen or whatever is not going to work there because of power to weight ratios. So I do think that it's an urgent challenge. I think we can run cars off electricity or hydrogen, provided we have zero carbon electricity, and we can see the future of that actually quite near to us. So I do think the biofuel challenge is one that we have to take on because it's going to be difficult to deal with aviation otherwise.
So I think on that note, we have to conclude. We can see that the subject is very vast. Maybe we did need another session on biofuels. We've done a whole session. Madhur, and you're right, we didn't even come to biofuels. So we need one more. But I must say I'm pleasantly surprised, not by the richness of the discussion on the panel. I knew who the panelists are, but I'm pleasantly surprised by the full hall, and also by the kind of interest and by the quality of questioning and ideas and suggestions that shows that finally maybe we are getting focused on one aspect of our lives that matters so much to our children and grandchildren. So thank you very much for that, and thank you very much, panelists. You've been wonderful.
Thanks a lot.